Welcome to Nature's Guardians. I'm Micah Siegel. Each week, I talk with people working to save and help animals around the world. They are nature's guardians, and you can become one too. Today, I'm talking with Markus Hofmeyr from the Rhino Conservation Fund. Great to have you back, Markus.
Hi there, and good to see you again as well, Mika.
To start, I want to thank you for being the first guest on my show and for all your help during the past year.
That's great, and I'm glad to see that you're moving along and achieving so much. Thanks.
I want to talk with you again because I recently spoke with Brian Child about his work with elephants in Botswana, and he showed me that trophy hunting elephants can really save them, and he thinks that should be a model for all of Africa. He says the same thing applies to rhinos. Then I spoke with Grant Folds, and Grant says it's a good idea, but it's too difficult to do that in other countries and get CITES to change their rules. So he thinks we should be trying to drive the demand for both elephant tusks and rhino horns to zero. As we know, Kenya is losing elephants every day, while Botswana has too many elephants. How do you see the situation for elephants and rhinos at the moment?
Okay, so that's a very good topic, and obviously there's a lot of opinions and polarized views on this. So I'll try and give you what my own personal views on this is and trying to be pragmatic and realistic about it. So there's no doubt that hunting and the trophy fees and the concession fees that went with it has been instrumental at saving wildlife in many African countries like Namibia, South Africa, Tanzania, historically in Botswana and in Zimbabwe. And in countries where there has been no sustainable use of wildlife, like Kenya, there has been a dramatic decline in wildlife numbers. Unfortunately, there's been a change and shift to the world's appetite to sort of support this, and that has now led to a murky and very convoluted world where there's these very polarized views on how this should happen. So just going back to the basics, if you have a situation where there's a hunting concession given out, it's actually a very light touch conservation model. You don't have huge camps, you haven't got massive infrastructure, and if you've got an ethical hunter that genuinely hunts only trophy animals or where there's good populations, it has and continues to be a very successful model of generating income for landscapes that are often very difficult to have conventional photographic tourism operations in. And I think that's sort of a baseline that we can easily go from. Where it gets very much more convoluted is where there's corruption involved and where trophy offtakes are much larger than they should be. Often the quotas are not developed scientifically, but they're very much driven by the government's financial targets that they set for themselves. And that then unfortunately gives ammunition to the naysayers that say that hunting is actually depleting wildlife numbers. And there are examples of that in many African countries where hunting takes place. There aren't many animals. There isn't really a good conservation grounding in which it happens. So in this very confusing world, we need to try and work with the stakeholders that are involved and create more environments where there's self-policing by the hunting industry to not allow unscrupulous operators to function, and also to have some independence in how quotas are set. And in that lies the problem. In a country like South Africa, it's possibly possible to do that. And in South Africa and Namibia, as two examples, there's now more animals on private land and in some reserves than there was at the beginning of the last century because of hunting, because there was a value added to the animals. And I think that's sort of the model I assume that you discussed with Brian Child with. I think that the sport hunting, where you're hunting for trophies, may in time become less relevant from a societal point of view. I think even in the US, where a lot of hunting takes place, there's a lower and a slower uptake of people buying hunting licenses which fund that whole model, because younger people are no longer wanting to do that because they don't see it as a sexy sport or anything. It's not quite like that in Africa yet, but it may well be influenced. So I think to make this all work properly is, countries that have got lots of wildlife should be empowered to make their own decisions, and they should be able to sustainably use those resources for the benefit of the country and the people that live in it. What will be very useful is if there's a constructive approach by CITES and all the NGOs that are involved in conservation to help make sure that the foundations and the policies that are in place to manage and control the hunting are responsible and scientifically based. And I think that's where the real challenge lies. And if you can get that right and have a couple of really good examples, I think that more countries will be more willing to take it up. The less you have of that, the more likely you are that the anti-hunting fraternity are going to be pushing back and saying, oh, well, here's enough examples of where corruption has crept in, quotas are being abused, animals are being shot, the officials that go with on the hunts are being bribed. All those things are unfortunately definitely happening and need to be rooted out if we want to continue down this sustainable use track.
Can you give us some examples of where countries' quotas have been exceeded?
I think in countries like Zimbabwe or Tanzania, where there's very little oversight during the hunts, currently with the very obscure government systems that are in place, and where there isn't any outside oversight, there are definite indications that hunters will go out, they'll shoot a female instead of a male. They will then bribe the game guard for not recording that quota, and then they'll shoot another animal, be it a buffalo or an elephant or any of those species. So those are countries where it definitely can happen. And in South Africa and in Namibia, where it's a little bit better controlled, it is also happening. I mean, there's something that I'd like to add very clearly. If you have a situation where people can privately own game, like you have in Namibia and South Africa, and have a game farm, where their very income depends on the model that they select, either hunting or ecotourism, it's obviously not going to be in their interest to over deplete the resource that they're hunting with. Yeah. And that's why there's such a successful model in those countries where hunting farms are often very well stocked, have got a sound approach to managing their natural resource, because that's the very income that they depend on. If it's a state-owned concession, like you see in Tanzania, in Botswana, and more so now in Zimbabwe, there isn't necessarily the same incentive for the hunter to look after that land, because he wants to make the maximum profit, because he's not sure if he's going to get his concession renewed. And that's where some of the discrepancies and the potential abuse takes place most often, are in those places where it's a state concession, poorly governed. The concession is not awarded in a way that can actually result into long-term planning and contractual agreements. Often it's short-term, and then you find that the hunters that take those concessions will maximize the extraction of value that they can in that short time that they have the concession.
Can the trophy hunters bring the ivory back home legally, and do they?
Yes, so if the hunt is legal and there's a CITES permit attached to it, they can bring their ivory back to countries where that agreement occurs. There's more and more countries, particularly first world countries, that are debating now. The UK is one of them. The US, there's a lot of pressure to do the same, where they want to ban the import of any hunting trophies to try and discourage people from going to hunt. But at this stage, the CITES regulations do allow, where there's legal hunts and legal quotas, that those quotas can then be, through a taxidermy, be exported to the country of where the hunter originated from. And it's a very sustainable model if it's done correctly, as I explained before.
Did Germany ban the return of ivory back to Germany?
I am not 100% up to date on that. I've not heard that, but there are lots of German hunters that do come to Africa, and the Germans themselves hunt a lot in their own country, and in fact they use it as a way to control their own deer populations, which will be uncontrolled if they didn't have hunters to do it. It's a very strict industry in Germany, so I don't think that would be the case, because they are very pragmatic about these things, but I may have missed something in the news.
What about CITES, and can they play a role in spreading sustainable use across Africa?
Yeah, so CITES is a convention under the International Union for Conservation of Nature, and it's set up specifically to make sure that there isn't unregulated and unlawful trade in endangered species, live or their products. And unfortunately, the convention has become very much a horse trading block where people with opposing views try and influence countries, because it's a membership driven organization or platform. When it comes to charismatic species like rhinos and elephants, there's often animal rights groups or non-sustainable use groups that fund countries, Kenya being an example, and then influence how their officials vote for a particular sustainable use outcome. And what you find in non-charismatic species and a lot of plant species, the votes are generally very pragmatic and science-based, which it's supposed to be. But when it comes to charismatic species like whales, elephants, leopards, cheetahs, rhinos, then the voting becomes a lot more congested with confusion, where people vote without necessarily looking at all the scientific facts. And this is where CITES has probably lost its ability to really influence responsible and science-driven sustainable use in the world. And hopefully there'll be some balancing out happening in the future, because countries are threatening to leave CITES because there's some countries like Botswana that have a lot of elephants, want to trade in their ivory legally, but the CITES rules don't allow that. And they're basically saying, well, why do countries that don't manage their elephants well have the same voting right as the countries that do manage the animals well? And that's an anomaly within CITES that hasn't been corrected with better constitutional rules and stuff like that.
Can you tell us what's happening with rhinos in all these countries right now?
So, as you know, as we discussed the first time we chatted, there are 5 species of rhinos, 2 in Africa, the African southern white rhino, and then the black or hook-lipped rhino. Last year was actually a relatively good year for African rhinos, because both white and black rhinos recorded an increase in numbers compared to the previous decade almost, when both of them were either stagnant or decreasing because of the poaching. Unfortunately, in 2024, there's definitely an upsurge in poaching in the countries where there's a lot of white and black rhinos, like South Africa and Namibia. The 3 Asian species are, I have to divide them up into the Indonesian species, that's the Sumatra and the Java rhino, and then the greater one-horned rhino, which exists in Nepal and India. So the greater one-horned rhino continues to increase very slowly. Their biggest block to good growth is expanding their range and putting more rhinos into parks where they used to occur. The translocations haven't quite been done as aggressively as we see translocations happening in Africa. But there isn't an immediate large threat from poaching. Yes, they have had some poaching losses, but far less than the actual recruitment. When it comes to the Sumatran and the Javan rhinos, that isn't the greatest of news. The Sumatran rhinos only now occur in the wild in one place on the planet, in the northern part of Sumatra Island. But there is a very good local NGO that's working hard with the government to actually protect those last few individuals, maybe as many as 50, we don't know. Java rhinos have gone through a very bad patch, and last year they recorded the first poaching case in Ujung Kulon National Park, where the only population of Java rhinos will occur. And subsequent to that, they've discovered more carcasses, so the population has declined since we last spoke or knew about. So unfortunately, they're in a very precarious situation, and there's a lot of effort now going into trying to secure that park better than what it has been up until now. In Africa, the picture is fairly patchy. There's poaching increases in Namibia and South Africa. There's been poaching recorded in Kenya and Zimbabwe, and then other countries have had no poaching recorded. But I'm very optimistic still for at least 3 out of the 5 species. There's a hopeful future. We hope to influence the impact that illegal wildlife criminals have on them. And maybe in time, the demand will change in the user countries for the horn. That is mostly China and Vietnam, but it's very, very difficult to understand exactly what's going on there and how to influence that constructively without people just reacting badly to some Western approach that's not appropriate culturally in their own country. So yeah, not all good news, but mostly good for at least 3 of the species.
Is there demand for trophy hunting rhinos?
So there's trophy hunting of rhinos in South Africa and Namibia, and they used to be in Botswana. I don't think it's allowed anymore. It is one species that if you do manage them correctly, it is an easy species to do very responsible and sustainable hunting, because most rhino populations are monitored to an individual level. So in the countries like South Africa and Namibia, where they do the hunting of rhinos, it's generally post-reproductive breeding or post-reproductive males, which are known by an exact ID because of the notches they cut in the ears. So it is being applied very responsibly, and the permits are generally quite strict on that. And it has no impact on the population, and it does leverage income for the owner or the custodian of those particular rhinos. So in Namibia, for example, rhino hunting probably has a net inflow of at least $1 million when they happen for the country and conservation. In South Africa, it's maybe a bigger amount, and that generally gets plowed back into better management and security for the rhinos on the properties that they occur. If it's going to return to Botswana, I don't know. They've had a very horrendous track record of looking after their rhinos. The only place where hunting could potentially happen sustainably and responsibly would be on the private lands where some people have reintroduced white rhino.
If you could create your dream scenario for Africa's wildlife and everyone agreed to your plan, what would it be, and what would it take to make it happen?
Yeah, that's a very good and interesting question. And as you know, I am from Africa and I'm deeply involved with conservation in Africa. I think what we need to create is an environment where conservation goes back to a state where it becomes a meritocracy, that i.e. that it's driven by merit and people's ability to do the job. I think there's been a lot of political interference with how conservation is done, and the landscape and the population of Africa is changing very rapidly. So we need to fast track the protection of the already established conservation areas, and we need to fast track the ability for conservation areas that can be connected with each other to encourage those connections. And we need to fast track the ability and the capability of each country in Africa to manage their own wildlife effectively, and not only with donor funding, but in fact encouraged and supported by the country's governments themselves. And for that to happen, corruption needs to be addressed very aggressively, and funding that is being made available needs to go to projects that actually do real good conservation on the ground, which are often not the big NGOs, but rather homegrown, functional NGOs. And for that to function in a way and be pragmatic, we need good governance. Merit needs to play a big role, and we need about $1 billion a year to actually achieve that. That would be my ideal little picture of what it would look like to achieve that in Africa. I think it's possible, but it's going to take a lot of cooperation, and conservationists must stop fighting with each other about what's the best outcome. Let people that know what's happening on the ground make the real decisions.
What about habitat and land corridors?
So that's very important. So being able to place value, ecological and biodiversity value to corridors is critically important. Like, for example, the elephant situation in Botswana, which we've spoken to for quite a bit. There is a potential that through well-managed and incentivized corridors, Botswana's elephants could move through Namibia into Angola, where if they had good protection and they could agree on the land use there, that would then in a way resolve the elephant problem there in a very short period of time. But that's not exactly how it works. There's incongruous land development that takes place. Planning for use of land is not aligned with all the different role players. Mining and agriculture always get preference over conservation. So there is a very urgent and important need for making it known through the best channels you possibly can how important ecological integrity and functionality is for this planet to survive. And part of that is connectivity between wild areas. And then also for animals to start playing their natural role at being able to move into new areas depending on what the climate and the nutrient requirements are for that, and having that as part of national and regional and international planning processes.
If you could make some changes in Kenya right now, what would you do?
I would definitely encourage private ownership of wildlife as a way to encourage people to create game farms and actually own the wildlife and have the income opportunities that they can. And I would even encourage them to consider revising the entire sustainable use model for wildlife, and encourage responsible sustainable use, and have stricter laws for irresponsible and illegal sustainable use.
Just quickly, what do you think should be done about rhinos in general? Last question.
I think rhinos are a very important species for us all to consider as a proxy for successful conservation. They are prehistoric mammals, successfully evolved to the point where they are now. And in a time when there were no humans with bullets and sharp knives and spears, they didn't have natural predators as adult animals. So what killed rhinos were rhinos themselves, stochastic events, and occasionally when they were calves or when they were injured, the predator might kill them. We need to now get to the point, because we are so successful at killing them and illegally extracting value from them, we need to get to the point where having them in a landscape and ensuring that they're protected represents a very successful model for how landscape conservation can take place. Because if a rhino can walk around with their horns on and breed naturally in an environment where people are living in that environment, but there's also wild areas, a lot of things would have been put in place that make conservation correct and sustainable into the future. So that's what we need to aim for rhinos, to act as a proxy for what successful conservation looks like.
So should the price of rhino horn be zero or high to encourage hunting?
I think the value of a live rhino should be more than a dead rhino. And currently, because of the illegal and completely black market price of a rhino horn, and the way that the horn is traded, it's currently more lucrative for a poacher to shoot a rhino and illegally sell that horn than to own a rhino and actually legally still looking after it. And I think if we can get to a point where the illegal component of the horn has got no value because it doesn't actually have those properties that people think they are, and it shouldn't be something that's traded in another country where there's no understanding of what it means to harvest rhino, but that the ecological functionality and the tourism value of that rhino should be where its value lies, i.e. the live animal breeding in its natural environment. So I think if we can take the horn out of the trading market system, and the only time a horn has got any value is when it's hunted sustainably and legally, then I think we're back on track with making sure that the value is correctly placed and falls into civil society responsible use and not into the criminal illegal ambit, which is currently the most perverse way in which people are using rhinos and their horns for benefit.
So you don't think there should be any trade in rhino horn at all?
Given the almost impossible a way to actually shut down the illegal market, even with the legal market, it's been proven over and over that legal markets do not close down illegal markets when it's already been well established in the crime syndicates. So we need to work towards a point where the live animal is more valuable than any dead animal. And the only reason a dead animal might have value is because it's post-reproductive and there's a hunting value attached to it.
So if I understand you correctly, you believe in trophy hunting and that hunters should be able to take their trophies home, but you don't think there should be a market for trading horns or tusks.
Yeah, I think the uses of ivory is very different. The problem with ivory is that you can only harvest it from a dead animal. You can't harvest it from a live animal. So there is always going to be that contentious ability. But I mean, if the trade could be managed in a way that it's responsible, which I don't think it can be, it could potentially be a revenue source for countries. But I was part of the first or the last once-off sale of ivory out of South Africa to Japan. And what happened is that the buyers all colluded, so they brought the price down, and the poaching on elephants in other countries escalated soon after that sale. So I think selling a commodity from a wildlife species from Africa in China without having a responsible way in which you can make sure that nobody in China buys it if they know that the elephants have been poached will always lead to illegal killing of an endangered species. So again, it's not a model that I think should be used to build future solutions. And I think societies are changing in that sense.
Thank you so much for talking with me today, Markus. I really appreciate your friendship and your dedication to helping animals. And thank you for watching. You can help animals by hitting the like button and subscribing to this channel. I'll see you next time on Nature's Guardians. Bye.